Thanks for listening to the Archbridge podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'll be talking with Mason Bishop. Mason is an adjunct fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the owner and principal at WorkED Consulting LLC, where he works on federal and state workforce development and higher education policies, practices, and programs. From 2001 to 2007, Mason served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training at the U.S. Department of Labor. Before that, he coordinated legislative efforts to create Utah's Department of Workforce Services. So with that, Mason, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.
Great. Well, clearly a lot of your career has been working with these different programs at various levels of government. I'm hoping, for the uninitiated, can you give us just kind of a brief overview of how the workforce training systems in America work and sort of at what level of government things are happening and how that all fits together?
Yeah, well, I'll try to be brief, but it's a little bit of a long and sordid history. The United States, the federal government has been engaged at the federal level really starting since the New Deal days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. And actually, I always maintain one of the challenges we face today is that so many of our current employment training programs have their genesis either back in the New Deal or the Great Society of the 1960s. And one of the little sayings I like to tell people is that what you see sometimes in federal government programs, unfortunately, is that we have New Deal and Great Society programs trying to operate in an iPhone economy. And so that creates a lot of challenges, frankly. And as in many other areas of our federal government, this one is one that is somewhat challenging to actually implement reforms and changes because you have entrenched interests and such that have developed over decades. But with that, essentially the start of the federal government's involvement during the New Deal was with the creation of unemployment insurance and what at the time was and is still called the Wagner-Pizer Employment Service Program, where they connected the idea of people who've been unemployed getting cash assistance through unemployment insurance and that they would get reemployment services through Wagner-Pizer funded. It was the Wagner-Pizer Act that funded it. And that really was, for a couple of decades until the Great Society, kind of the extent. And then starting in the 1960s, you had different programs that started, which eventually became in the 1970s. One that's really well known is CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. It's typically well known because it was somewhat of a failure. And when President Reagan came in 1981, CETA was one of the programs he targeted for reform. CETA was essentially a program where local governments got funds to create summer jobs programs and other types of public works kind of programs. And one of the issues that developed around that is that for unemployment insurance in the Wagner-Pizer program, and this is true today even in 2021, the federal government provided funds to states to operate those programs and a lot of other, frankly, employment training programs. But starting with CETA and moving forward into the Job Training Partnership Act in 1982, the Workforce Investment Act in 1998, and now what we operate under is called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA for short, which passed in 2014. Starting with CETA, the federal government created what you could think of as a federal-local funding relationship. What that means is that for now, the WIOA funds that are appropriated and go to states for adult, dislocated worker, and disadvantaged youth services, those funds then go through the states down locally, a vast majority of them, to local workforce boards to implement. Now, each state's slightly different and calls it something different. But essentially, if you look at the Government Accountability Office and a couple of reports they issued back in 2011 and an update a couple of years ago, we have really a hodgepodge, I'll call it, of 40 to 50 federally funded programs that all have an employment and training kind of outcome that are coming through a myriad of federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Labor, my old agency, U.S. Department of Education, Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Agriculture. has a food stamp employment and training program, for instance. And all of these come down to the state and or local communities in one form or another. And frankly, for the person who's unemployed looking for assistance, can be quite complicated at times. Or if you're an employer looking for skilled workers, it can be quite complex.
Are all of those programs under WIOA? Is that sort of the umbrella, or are they? Is that separate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, starting with the Workforce Investment Act in 1998 and moving forward into WIOA, there were two basic things those laws have done. One is they obviously, what I already mentioned, authorized funding itself for employment and training for adults, low-income adults, dislocated workers, and disadvantaged youth. But it also, starting in 1988, created what was called the One-Stop Career Center system. The federal government, Department of Labor, has branded it the American Job Center. So if you see that terminology, you kind of know what I'm talking about. The idea being that all of these different programs coming through these different federal agencies, and frankly, in many cases, different different state agencies, that they would all come together under this one-stop system and deliver coordinated or integrated services. To be frank, that has been successful or unsuccessful depending on what state you're in.
Okay.
My old state of Utah is highly successful because in the 1990s, we literally, Governor Mike Leavitt at the time said, we're not going to operate in this kind of silo format. And so he undertook and spent a considerable amount of his own political capital, frankly, helping get through the legislature, and I assisted him on this, on integrating 4 to 5 different state agencies into the Utah Department of Workforce Services. And in Utah, they're what's called a single state designation, meaning that the Utah Department of Workforce Services, none of the money flows locally. It all stays at the state level with DWS, and the Department of Workforce Services runs all the one-stop career centers in Utah. So no matter where you go in Utah, you get a consistent and specific set of employment and training services, including welfare. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which again was the welfare reform that passed in 1996, is delivered through the Department of Workforce Services. So in Utah, literally there's one state agency and one set of offices that no matter where you are in the state, you go to get services. That is pretty rare, unfortunately. Like here in Virginia, where I live now, you have the Virginia Employment Commission that runs the unemployment insurance and Wagner-Pizer program. You have the Virginia Community College system that administers the WIOA, Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth Services. You have the Department of Social Services doing TANF. You have the Department of Education doing vocational rehabilitation. You really have 5 or 6 different state agencies supposedly coming together as a one-stop system, but that's maybe one stop in name only for
I see.
Fact of the matter. So, and you've got everything in between Utah and Virginia in the United States, depending on to what level, in my opinion, governors have been willing to expend some level of political capital to kind of clean and straighten this all up. Right.
So if you were just, in an average state and you lost your job, you would have your unemployment benefits, right?
Yes.
Presumably. And so you would go to one place for that. And then if you fell below a certain income threshold, you'd go to maybe a different place for the TANF and, SNAP, depending.
Food stamp, probably foods. Like, so if let's say you were a man and you were married and you got laid off from your job, you would apply for UI probably through the phone or internet. Most claims taking is now electronic. And you saw with the pandemic what a mess that ended up being. They were wholly unprepared for the kind of numbers that came all at once at them in most states. And then, yes, if you then felt like, well, I want to apply for food stamps, or SNAP it's called now, Food and Nutrition Services, yes, that's typically, that application is through a different state agency, usually like a human services or social services agency. And then if you're maybe have a disability and you want disability services and you go to either Voc Rehab or something, that's a whole nother process and such. And so if you want a physical place to end up walking into, while it might be called a one-stop center, that's probably not the only door you're going to end up walking through, unfortunately. Again, in Utah it would be, but in most other states, it's 2 to 3 doors you're walking through.
Okay. So that seems like it makes a lot more sense then to come up with, a single place where a person can walk in and develop a plan, in terms of what they need on unemployment insurance or other temporary benefits.
Absolutely.
And then also sort of training if that's something. So
yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what's the demographic of people that would utilize these programs? Or, is it presumably not everyone who gets laid off or leaves a job, or gets fired or something like that is looking to be retrained or find a new career path or even, enter any sort of education at all. But I guess some are. So can you explain sort of who might use these programs and what kind of demographic is that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because when I first came to Washington, D.C. in 1999, there was a lot of debate around this. At the time, I would sit in different meetings and people would say, oh, we need to be all things to all people. We need more professionals coming into our one-stops and such. And in my mind, I always thought that was misguided, because I always felt like if you look at how, if anybody who's listening thinks about how did I get my last 3 jobs, I'd be willing to bet it was because you knew somebody referred you, or somebody gave you a reference, or it was based on your networks. And it's the days of sort of putting out 50 resumes and hoping to get the right job, I think is kind of a day of yesteryear. I think when we want to help people get reemployed now, it's about breaking down the barriers to access, to entry, so to speak. And those barriers typically revolve around networks, around understanding who and how to access employment. It's not so much, and in a number of cases, that people don't have the skills aligned to the jobs of today. The technology, in particular, is a problem. If you don't have certain technology skills or background, that can be a barrier to access into entry. So even back in 2001, when I started Department of Labor, I always sort of believed that we needed to focus on the individuals who have lacked those opportunities because they don't have they grew up in a community where and now you can see that play out in urban settings, or it might be in rural settings. To me, sort of the typical kind of person that I think is appropriate for the government to focus helping are the ones that, lost their jobs in a 200-person layoff in some community because their plant just went to China.
Right.
I mean, clearly the government, in my opinion, has an obligation to help retrain and retool those individuals. I think, now, the conversation we've been having nationally in the last year around, with George Floyd's passing and those sorts of issues that have occurred, I think clearly there's an appropriate place for the government to say, if young people growing up in urban settings through no fault of their own don't have access to quality education such that retraining or training is appropriate, or help with the kinds of skills you need that maybe you should have gotten in public schools, but the public school system was not very good or whatever. Ben, I'm a big believer personally that, education is the great equalizer. I absolutely believe that education and skills training, and it's why I'm in this business, and that the core of most people's, I used to say this in speeches all the time, that the core of, addressing people's issues, whether, and that can include housing and food assistance, other things, is employment. That education and employment are the core of what each of us needs and our families need to be sustainable and upwardly mobile over time. And so I've always been about, I like to think of myself as a disruptor and a reformer. I've been about trying to yell from the mountaintops, so to speak, so that we can break through whether it be at the federal or state levels, these sort of entrenched interests and silos that exist to say, look, there's a better way we can help people. And so when you ask me a question of who that is, I think, as I mentioned, it's the young man or woman in the urban community that went to a really bad public school.
Right.
It can be the 50-year-old who worked at a plant for 30 years, has only a high school education and diploma, and their factory just went to China. It can be people that, frankly, are dealing with opioid issues and things like that and have barriers because of that. It can be somebody who was incarcerated. I do a lot of work currently and in the past around, how do we help incarcerated individuals get back onto a path post-release that keeps them from returning. And
a lot of times that involves getting them into an employment situation.
Absolutely.
And of course, to get to that level, oftentimes they need some sort of, you have to have skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And exposure to, let me give you a quick story on that, as I've been doing some work in Missouri with a community college that is partnered with Missouri Department of Corrections. And a couple of years ago, I was out there visiting with them, and they said, they have a facility there near Jefferson City that no matter how long you've been in prison, you're ultimately going to be released. If you're in that facility, it's sort of there's about 1,500, and it was a men's only facility. They're going to be released at some point. And you have some individuals that have been there, maybe a couple of years, and you have others been there 20, 25, 30 years. They may have been there under a manslaughter charge or something like that. And but they're going to be released. And anyway, this friend of mine said, Mason, it's eye-opening because the warden of the facility allows the incarcerated individuals to take laptops and technology into their cell to be able to do some skills training, basic skills training that we're providing. And she said, what we start getting questions about, they get handed a laptop and say, how do I turn it on?
Right.
How do I use this? And when you start to realize that all across the United States, we're releasing people out of all kinds of corrections facilities who went in before iPhones were ever out and widely used, don't know how to use iPhones, don't know what they are, don't know how to use laptops, don't know how to use the technology we so rely on, don't know use the technology allowing us to have this podcast right now.
Right.
And when you start to realize that, you start to think, wow, we've got a lot of work to do around education and training to help get people up to a level where they can stay out of prison. Can you imagine not knowing how to use an iPhone or a laptop and all of a sudden you're out and been released and you're supposed to make a go of it? I mean, that's tough.
And that's kind of, it's just, there's something about that feels deeply unfair to say, you've been out of this, system for so long and it's changing very quick. I mean, even for people like me, it's sometimes hard to keep up with how software changes and technology and all this kind of stuff. And it's, I'm sure that's multiplied for people who are just don't have access to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
And here, another big thing I've been working on with, especially with a lot of community colleges that I work with, is how do we upskill and retool people very quickly too? Because, the fact is, especially in today's economy, most people can't stay out of the labor market for 2 years to get an associate degree or 4 years to get a bachelor's degree. I mean, they need and so it's been interesting to watch. We're seeing a lot around reforms in education that we're seeing due to COVID and stuff, but I think some of this started before COVID even. And I'm a big proponent of, if we're going to serve the individuals we're talking about on this podcast well, educational institutions have got to start getting much more flexible and adaptable and proactive around providing quicker options and that are linked to employers and employment and the kinds of things people need to be viable in the labor market.
Yeah. And
that the days of faculty members thinking, well, we need this and we need that, and I'm only going to, do it certain hours of the day and stuff. Those are the days, those are going by fast too.
Yeah.
Because frankly, the community college and universities that don't figure this out, they're going to see dwindling enrollments. I have no doubt in my mind that's going to happen.
I just can't imagine, telling somebody like, okay, you're here, you've walked into one of these centers, we're gonna help you, but you're not gonna have like a full-time job for 2 years or something. That seems insane to me. It just seems untenable.
Well, that's in terms of retraining. Yeah, that's the thing is if somebody comes, I mean, I can tell you another quick story. I mean, this really was, it's so interesting because, especially when you're in a job like I had at the Department of Labor where I was a political appointee, you get invited to very important community events and meetings, and members of Congress want you to come talk to their constituents. And I had the opportunity, one of the employment and training programs that I oversaw that I continue to sort of consult with Hill staff around is trade adjustment assistance. This is a program that started in 1974 that was linked to Free Trade and Trade Promotion Authority, where, hey, we're negotiating all these new free trade agreements that, the theory over decades was, including the Bush administration, was that free trade was good for the United States as a whole, but that there would be pockets of people. And of course, one of the interesting things with the Trump presidency is I think that what has been that theory or belief for 2 or 3 decades kind of has come crashing down very quickly in about 2 to 3 or 4 years. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I want to dig into that. I want you to finish the story too, but I want to dig into that because that's, looking at the economics, exactly what you laid out is textbook, sort of what I would think, trade, it's good for the nation as a whole. Consumer products, prices fall. But you have these pockets that, we don't really know what to do with, because they're typically, they might be older. The thought of going back to school for some of these guys is just not really something that they're going to consider very much. So I'm very curious to hear a little more about that.
Well, you're segueing right to my story. So Congressman Dave Camp at the time asked me to come to Michigan. Whirlpool was laying off 300 people because their plant was going overseas or Mexico or somewhere like that.
Sure.
And I'll never forget, after giving this sort of seminar, in front of this community college gym full of people where we're telling everybody, just go to the community college, get retrained. I was talking to this couple and they were probably in their late 50s to maybe 60. And they weren't completely hopeless, but they just kind of had that, they were trying to stay optimistic, but you could tell it was tough, and they look a little beat down, they'd life of hard work, some people have that look to them.
Yeah.
And super nice people. And they come up to me and say, Mr. Bishop, should we go enroll what should we do? Should we enroll at the community college? And so I kind of had a chat with the two of them. They both had worked at Whirlpool. And one interesting irony was he was definitely thinking of enrolling community college. I was kind of giving the pep talk or whatever. And I said to her, what about you? She said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, well, you need to get retrained too. Well, I don't know if that's it. It was an interesting kind of difference between kind of the expectation that the man would get retrained, but the woman who also was being laid off hadn't really thought about getting retrained. And I thought that was, you talk about kind of gender differences and other things that we talk about societally. I thought that was kind of interesting. That they sort of equally didn't recognize the. So I kind of was talking about that. I said I was kind of trying to talk her up, and no, you need to think about that, and you guys need to support each other and retrain together, and all of that. So I was doing that. But I came back to Washington D.C. after that experience, going, oh my God, we are just kind of telling everybody, just go to the community college, and we're putting the community colleges in this position of all of a sudden they got 300 people showing up at their doors, and they don't have the capacity or ability to handle that anyway. So to make a long story short, I kind of wrote in some ideas that became policy for the Bush administration that actually got carried into the Obama administration around community college training dollars. And actually some of that got funded during the Obama years. Actually, there was about $2 billion that went out to community colleges to help with retraining people. And right now TA is being reauthorized, and there's talk about, with the $3.5 trillion stuff, there's a lot of talk about putting money out for community colleges and for retraining. But it gets back to your question around trade and these other things, is that I think some of what's changed since I was at the Department of Labor was, I think, again, there was kind of this assumption and understanding that overall, in terms of trade, that trade was good for the country. It brought us consumer products at much lower prices, frankly, and that sort of thing. But I kind of think what's happened in the Trump years, it's just my opinion, is a lot of people have kind of looked inwardly and said, the fact that my well, we don't use VCRs anymore, right? So that's all gone away. But the fact that I have a HD TV that only cost me $200 instead of $400 because, we got rid of 10,000 jobs in the United States and produce them over in China. I think a lot, I don't know. I kind of get the feeling most people kind of think, I'm not sure that bargain was worth it.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of that. And, I'm aware of, that kind of trade-off. And, putting my economics hat on, I would say, that savings gets reinvested into the economy. It's not like it disappears. We're just reallocating resources to the more efficient use. And I think what we've seen is, ever since the Great Recession, back in, 2008, 2009, the big thing has been, if you look at the top level numbers of our GDP and our income growth, things are looking pretty good. The recovery wasn't as good as it could have been, as a lot of people were talking about at the time. From 2008.
It was too slow.
It was too slow. It wasn't as much as we expected, but we did recover from a lot of that stuff. And there's a group out there called the Economic Innovation Group, EIG, and they do they put out this report that they call the Distressed Communities Index. And one of the things that is really prominent in their research is, if you look at the top line recovery numbers, since 2008, 2009, you've got things looking okay, but that recovery has been extremely geographically uneven, right? So you have top line figures that make everything look okay, but what you're seeing is bigger cities and sort of metropolises, and a lot of times they're centered around the coasts. Obviously you have places like Chicago and Milwaukee and some of these bigger metro areas, but much of this recovery has been concentrated in these more urbanized areas and sort of the suburbs and the exurbs there. And a lot of the more rural areas that used to have, the model was they had a big plant that employed a big chunk of the population. There was nothing that replaced them in those communities. And so while you have a good recovery and the economics overall is holding sound, that savings from those consumer products has been reinvested to more efficient uses, and we've got more jobs and more opportunities, more income growth. It's concentrated in those areas, and there's not very much of that going on in some of the areas where that stuff was taken away. And so I don't know what we do about that exactly. There's kind of a debate.
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's even more nuanced than that. So I in some of the work I've been doing, it's really, some people have used this phrase. I use it. It's pockets of poverty. Yeah. It's amazing. You can almost look at any county in the United States. So Palm Beach is an area I've done a lot of work in. Palm Beach State College is one of my clients. I've done a lot of work. I've done grant writing and evaluation and some economic labor market analysis and the like. And one of the grants I did for the Department of Labor required me to look at zip codes. And I also did the same thing in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and in North Carolina. I was doing some work in some different places. And Palm Beach is like such a great example to me, because if you go to Palm Beach County, of course, we've heard a lot in the news. Obviously Mar-a-Lago's there, but if you go along the coast of Palm Beach, you'll find the richest of the rich, right? Wealth, unbelievable amounts of wealth, right? But if you go to the western part of Palm Beach County, you'll find the poorest of the poor. And literally within Palm Beach County itself, once you get across the A1A highway there, you literally will see, it's almost like the old analogy of the railroad tracks. And I guarantee, and you can pull any county in the United States, probably with the most recent census data is just coming out, and you will see by zip code, you will see a wealthy zip code with like 1% unemployment, no poverty, and literally the zip code next door is at 30% poverty and 10% unemployment. And it's really startling when you start to kind of see maps of counties and states where you see what's going on, and realizing that in this country, we're segregated by almost literally by zip code into opportunity societies and disadvantaged society. I mean, it's
yeah.
And it doesn't always run along racial lines or, the typical kinds of things we think about and factor into these issues that, and when you start to realize that dynamic, it kind of changed from a policy standpoint, starts to change your approach, which is we need to focus on, it's kind of like Tim Scott's and President Trump's opportunity zone idea. Like, we need to start thinking about investments in helping communities and neighborhoods almost to that micro level.
Yeah.
Because you can literally have kids in high school. I see it here in Fairfax County, just in my little geographic area. The high school that I live right by here is big and fairly wealthy and and I can go 3 miles away to the next high school that's serving a lot more immigrants, people of color, a lot poorer high school, not as well resourced probably. And you see that almost everywhere. You don't have to travel very far to see that your neighborhood may be doing okay and the neighborhood over from you is struggling mightily. So how do we address employment and training, and from that standpoint is something that I've become very interested in.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about opportunity zones as well, because I'm a little torn on that. On the one hand, I like the idea of sort of helping to direct private funding to those areas that are particularly hard hit and need that sort of private investment. But on the other hand, I know that those kinds of things can be gamed in the sense where, you have, it's kind of like some of these economic development programs that are run at the state level, right? You have maybe a long-standing furniture store, but they want to put an IKEA in. So the IKEA gets these tax breaks and, abatements and credits and, all this kind of stuff. And so now you have this uneven competition, and like the family furniture store just can't compete with the big guy that's come in and has got all this special treatment. And I see some stuff like that happening with those opportunity zones where you're giving kind of preferential treatment in some of these areas. But maybe that's a concern that's just overblown. I don't know that we have enough evidence yet on that. I think that's definitely one possible policy that could work. There's kind of that's sort of like one of the place-based models, right? It's like, how can we revitalize these places? The opposite approach is something that's been advocated by, I think most notably, Kevin Williamson at National Reviews, talked about maybe giving vouchers for people to move out of areas where there just simply isn't employment opportunities. There simply isn't job opportunities.
Yeah,
so how do you think about...
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I'm curious of how you might weigh some of those differences.
I'm not sure. Yeah. So it's interesting from an employment and training perspective. I sort of believe, I think giving people vouchers to move will not be that successful because, again, trade adjustments is a program where people do get relocation assistance and nobody ever uses it.
Really?
I think a lot of people want to stay in their communities. I mean, it's kind of like the whole rural community problem we have, which is it's kind of that on the one hand, people want opportunities, but it's like we don't want too much opportunity because then it'll change the nature of what we like about our community, which is it's all in rural and there aren't too many people like around, you know. So I used to see that in Utah, traveling around Utah all the time. It was kind of like, we want, jobs and we want this and we want that, but like, it was almost like, but we don't want Salt Lake telling us and all these people coming in from Salt Lake to, to move in here and ruin what we love about the community,
Yeah.
So I think that's always kind of an interesting dynamic. I
mean, that's definitely true. I was just in Utah a few weeks ago for a conference, and I was talking to one of the guys it was this whole thing. We drove out to Olympic Park out there in Park City.
And, that's a lot of fun. Yeah.
And I had another dinner appointment, and we were at the conference hotel, and I'm just thinking, I'll just stop by this reception, maybe talk to a couple people, and then head over to dinner. Did not realize that it was a 45-minute bus ride, out there and back. And so we basically got out there, and I had to get on the bus and go right back if I was going to make my appointment. So that was a lot of fun. But I did get to chat with the driver a lot on the way back. And he was telling me about Park City and how things have changed. And it's very similar to that dynamic you're describing, where he's happy for these opportunities and seeing all that stuff, but at the same time, he's kind of uncomfortable with, all of the millionaires moving in and building these mansions in Park City. And, so that dynamic out there in Utah is still existing.
Yeah. Well, if you go the other side down to Heber City and Midway, it's even worse. Because Heber City used to be like a dot on the map, and now
that's where he was from, actually.
Yeah, that's what's changing a lot. Park City's always been a little bit of the snooty, upscaley kind of town in Utah. Yeah. But what's happening is all the town. If you can't afford, the kind of the high Park City stuff, so everybody started buying up land in Heber City and Midway and all those places. Of course, when the Olympics showed up in '02, everybody realized, this is gorgeous all up in through here. So you can get property in Heber City for really cheap and stuff. And anyway, so yeah, but when it comes to employment training, I think that's, to me, the issue is targeting efforts in dollar. First of all, it's recognizing that we have these sort of dynamics in the country, that it's not just cities versus rural areas or suburbs versus, that we do, from a data perspective, need to look at labor markets sort of in very dynamic ways and understand that people are living in communities fairly close to each other where some people may not need targeted employment and training assistance and other people do need it. And how do we focus on those communities that are falling behind? Because even if you look at from an economic development lens, we've always kind of said this now for a couple of decades, but I think it's even more and more pronounced now that it is much less about tax policy, and it's much less about, infrastructure is still important, but if you look at it, the whole town, a lot of relocation decisions and other kinds of things are based on, do we have a skilled workforce? In other words, if I've got a 200 job kind of situation here, I'm going to go to where I have an education system, a training system, and others that can get me 200 well-skilled people who can function really well on the job. And I'm going to go to that community versus another community where I'm not too sure I can get 200 people to make my company productive and such. So,
right. So how do we sort of target some of these things? I think it's really interesting that the relocation stuff is not used. I guess this is, I'm kind of hitting on some themes from, Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, or, Chris Arnaud, who wrote, Dignity. This seems like kind of a similar theme where, I'm a lot of the people that I know and I went to college with and, in my social circles and professional networks, a lot of us don't live where we grew up. I grew up in California. I live in Alaska now. I spent a lot of time in DC. I'm very mobile in that sense. And I recognize that there's a whole portion of people that's just not their reality. They're much more rooted in their communities. And I think that's probably, I'm sure, there's pros and cons to both. Yeah. But in some ways, I think that's a really good thing. They're able to develop those social bonds, really establish that sort of social capital. That's what I try to do here. I think we're going to be here to stay. But in a sense, I think that maybe I'm missing out because I wasn't doing that from a younger age. So I understand maybe that, people don't want to move, but how do we target that? You mentioned community colleges playing a role here. Do you still, and from your story, in Michigan, do you still think community colleges are sort of the bread and butter of how this gets done?
Yeah, in fact, I would almost go a little bit further. I think they're our only hope.
Interesting. Okay.
And the only reason I say that is because it's the one institution that exists throughout every community in the United States. And so there's an infrastructure there. There is a set of programs. There's at least, it's kind of the one sort of, I think, connecting point in communities between all of these issues. Now, to me, the challenge of community colleges is that there needs to be a recognition, especially federally, that, and I've been saying this now for a few years because I came to a recognition when I started consulting full-time in 2012, is that you've got about 1,100 community colleges in the country. What people seem to fail to realize is that about 100 to 150 of them are well-resourced, larger enterprises, and the other 1,000 are small 1 to 3 building operations in very rural or suburban areas of our country. And so I've been a big proponent. It's what I've ended up doing in my consulting business, frankly, in a lot of what I do, is how do you support and provide technical assistance and others to these community colleges so they can make sure they're up on the latest kind of programming that needs to occur, that they have the capacity to address. And that was my concern in Michigan, is just having the capacity to address a big layoff and such. Right. And so that's what I find is an issue with the community colleges, is having the capacity and the expertise and others to be able to address their community's issues in a well-resourced way. Now, I will be the first to tell you, the Biden administration is trying to create free community college tuition. I think that's a big mistake. I think the minute the community colleges become beholden to the federal government for a big chunk of their funds will ruin what's good about community colleges, which their ability to innovate, adapt, and be flexible based on community needs and state needs. And I remain one who's very concerned, and I think it'd be a big mistake to I'll call it federalizing community colleges by paying everybody's community college tuition, because you know how the federal government is. Once you do that, they're going to demand you got to do this, you got to do that, and once you get on that, once the community colleges are on that funding trough, I think it could very well ruin what makes community colleges great, in my opinion.
I mean, if history is any guide with traditional institutions of higher education, that's exactly what you've seen. You've seen, exactly. Ballooning administrations, basically just coming up with ways to suck up those funds in a way that, frankly, does not necessarily serve the best interests of the students.
Not attached to labor market outcome. Well, and that's the other thing too, is then all of a sudden the federal government will start demanding, well, here's what you've got to do. You've got to have these outcomes. You've got to have that outcomes. And some of those outcomes may be misguided. Some of those outcomes may be, and I see this kind of gets back full circle to the start of our conversation, which is the whole workforce system in the country. One of the big problems we have is these laws like WIOA create these one-side, and I've written about this in some of my AEI work that you've talked about, or
and I'll link to a bunch of that as well in this conversation.
Well, what you find is that so many of these programs over the decades have created these one-size-fits-all solutions, and so you spend half your time at the state and local level trying to comply with federal requirements that make no sense whatsoever. I'll give you one right now. As a result of COVID, that's really kind of interesting, is the WIOA requires that every local workforce investment area in the country, and there's like 600 of them in the different states, must have what's called a comprehensive physical one-stop center. So everybody has to have a building where all these partner programs, about 16 or 17 of them, you have access to all these partner programs in that one-stop center. Well, guess what's happening as a result of COVID? You got a lot more virtual services, you got a lot more things, and maybe you don't need be paying for a big building. Because we already have a big problem unfortunately, too many of the dollars under WIOA go to pay all the bureaucratic administrative requirements of facilities and staffing and this and that, and very little of the money actually goes to retrain workers. WIOA is often thought of as a job training program, but it's really not, because hardly any of the money actually goes to job training. It goes more to like career services and light touch kinds of services, and that's one of the big problems with the law, with the way the law is structured, I think. So, I mean, that's just one example of a federal mandate in a law that Congress passed, that you must have one physical comprehensive center, that I've started saying, now that we've had COVID, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
We ought to have multiple access points in communities. We need to have virtual access points and physical access points. We don't need to use one or two in a community.
Right. And that's a requirement to get the funding that they have to do that.
Yeah. And so, and the law, and we is full of that kind of stuff. And I've been a big proponent of, and obviously employment training is probably not the only place this needs to happen, but we need to move away from the continual march toward federalization and nationalization of all of our different laws and policies and programs in this country. It is a wrong-headed approach, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It does not work. It's not effective. And the federal government is not capable of addressing so many of these very dynamic, localized issues. Employment training is just one, and we could go on for hours on many others, but we'll stick to the topic of the day, which is that we need to demand of Congress, in my opinion, to get away from mandating these things and start providing for demonstrations and flexibility and let states innovate. I'm a big believer in states. I think states are where innovation can occur and where choices can be made. And frankly, you want to talk about relocation. I mean, COVID's a perfect example. You see people making relocation decisions based upon different COVID restrictions or non-restrictions, right?
Yeah.
Freedom of movement. That's the kind of thing we need to allow states to also do in our employment training laws, is try different approaches that may get more money to retraining, that may better bolster their community college systems and fund them and those kinds of things. But no, we have so many mandates. And unfortunately, I think the Biden administration wants to take it further down that kind of federally mandated path. And that will happen if everybody gets free community college tuition. So I really hope that doesn't occur.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought, because I mean, you know, as we've talked here, you've talked about how you're a big proponent of community colleges. And at the same time, you don't want, you know, free tuition, you know, for these things.
Nothing's ever free.
Yeah, exactly. And that's I think that is a really interesting outlook there. So is this something where we could follow the model of some of the welfare reforms and block grants, maybe transition some of these WIOA grants into block grants? Is that sort of the preferred solution? Yeah,
absolutely. No, you're getting to absolutely where I would take this if I was king for a day, is a lot of these programs actually in TAA reauthorization. I've been a proponent of using
what is NTA?
Trade Adjustment Assistance. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. It's up for reauthorization again, and I gave some congressional testimony in March, and one of the things I proposed was, let's learn from the lessons of welfare reform and realize that you need to create transitions for people off of government assistance programs and back into employment. One of the things we learned in welfare reform is that if you create transitional benefit programs, if you know, you get a job and you lose all benefits, people wouldn't get the job because they were worse off with the job than they were on all the welfare benefits, right? So what did we learn in welfare reform? Well, if you get a job, maybe you lose your cash assistance, but you still keep transitional Medicaid and food stamps and childcare. And as you get more wages and employment, you start to get weaned off of these other government programs. And what did we see? Well, lo and behold, people got off of government, right? And so I've always said the same thing with like a program like Trade Adjustment Assistance, which provides up to 2 years of unemployment benefits and 2 years of training assistance. Well, there's a lot of people that don't want to be out of the labor market for 2 years in order to get trained. So why don't we create transitional benefits and, for lack of a better term, subsidize people if they do get a lower wage job? Well, let's let them stay in that training program while they work and provide maybe a small subsidy to go along with that wage.
Honestly, it's unbelievable that we're not doing that now.
But we don't do any of this stuff in most of these programs. It drives me crazy. So we learn, the irony is, Ben, we learn lots of lessons when we do things like welfare reform and experiment, and we see what works and what doesn't. And yet we're not willing to take those lessons and apply them to other federal programs because all the incentives of political power don't allow for it. Politicians would rather keep their little areas of congressional, committee jurisdictions, and we want our pot of money here, and we want to keep funding our constituency group over there. And so all the incentives are there in our governance in America right now to keep things inefficient, frankly. I hate to say it, but it's the truth.
No, I think that is, especially at the federal level, that's...
And the people hurt are the workers and the employers, because we run inefficient systems that at the end of the day don't really help the workers and employers to the level they could.
Yeah.
If we would allow states to actually be flexible. I mean, my goodness, Ben, you're up in Alaska, for heaven's sakes. I mean, Alaska is much different than Northern Virginia, where I am. It's much different than Maine, where I'm from originally. It's much different than Arizona, where I grew up as a teenager. And it's much different than Florida and Texas and everything in between.
Yeah. We're
a very diverse, big country. And the idea that we can run everything out of Washington, D.C. is ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's a lesson that I feel like we're just learning over and over and over again. But so what, Utah is obviously an example of a state that really took some initiative. Obviously, you were part of that really sort of tried to move this ball forward. So how can other state lawmakers, maybe other governors that want to do something similar to that, or want to try to get out from some of these federal requirements, what would you recommend to them rather than, just waiting on the federal government to change, which I got to say is not something I'd bet on, in the near future?
No, that's a great question. That's a $64 question, right? Well, I would start with governors. It all begins and ends with the governor. We wouldn't have had workforce service if it hadn't been for Governor Mike Leavitt. And I would say that it takes a governor who's willing to take on some interest in his or her own state, and be willing to develop a vision and just kind of continue to work on getting there and expend, frankly, some of his or her political capital. So it starts with governors. Secondly, part of the work I'm in the middle of right now as part of my American Enterprise Institute work is we're developing a toolkit of just kind of some one-pagers and topical pieces on what Utah did, and to provide, technical assistance and other opportunities to governors who may want to do something different. The thing to understand is it's not a short-term process. In Utah, it took us 2 years or so to get to where we were, and it continued. And in the paper I did around Utah for AEI, for the American Enterprise Institute, I show that not only did we have sort of that initial effort back in '96 and '97, but the departments continued to evolve for 20 years. They've continued to add programs. I mean, Medicaid eligibility became part of DWS, and housing programs. And in 2016, Voc Rehab got moved from the Department of Education and Workforce Services. So it's ever evolving in terms of what makes sense for that state. But I've always believed it starts, frankly, Ben, with a recognition that there's a problem. And one of the things I've tried to do through my work at AEI and other places is show that I don't think a lot of governors and even legislators really understand the level of resources coming into their states for employment and training through these different programs. So that's step one. And then step two is demonstrating to them, look, here are all the different agencies, and here's how fragmented it actually is in your state. Do you realize that? And we did, again, you can go on the AEI website, we did a series a year or so ago of one-pagers to show in each state, here's how some of your programs are funded, and here's the agencies they're coming through, and here's the level of it, because I sort of believe that it starts with the transparency of information and data. And then, so once you know what the data is, once you know what the issues are, once you decide, okay, I've got the political will to do it, then it's a strategic process, just like any other kind of private or public sector, large organizational change, where you have planning. We had planning committees, we had stakeholder engagement and sessions, we had employers and worker advocates and others engaged, and you just have to go through that process, and people have to be willing to put down their sort of personal interests and really think through this from what's best for employers and workers in our state and employment in our state. If you have people willing to do that, you can do all kinds of great stuff. Yeah.
I guarantee you a lot of people, even people that work in, a lot of the fields that overlap with what I work on and some of what you work on, I just don't think this is just something you don't hear about very often. I guarantee you most of these people who are involved in state level stuff don't have a good grasp, and I'm not saying I have a good grasp on it, but the amount of, I did look at that report that you put out with the one pager, and I looked at Alaska and some of the other states as well, and just the amount of different agencies is astounding.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening when you realize 3 or 4 different state agencies or more. North Carolina, their legislature did an audit back, I think it was right around 2014. I was involved down there around 2014. Did an audit and showed that 8 different state agencies were involved. It was a really well-done report. It was one of the best I've seen, especially coming out of a legislative audit. And it showed 8 different state agencies and exactly how much money and how it was coming through. And it was pretty eye-opening, I think, for a lot of legislators to realize what was going on in North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, with a little bit of time that we have left here, I want to talk a little bit about COVID. So we've talked about some of the role of community colleges, and maybe we can come back to that. It's probably, I kind of think it's the same in Virginia, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Certainly here in Alaska, we go out to our downtown here in Anchorage, signs up saying, we're one of the most popular restaurants in the city. We're closed 2 days a week, cannot find staff.
Yeah.
We were just down in Seward, Alaska, showing a friend of ours around out there, and the popular breakfast spot closed, can't find staff.
Yeah.
This major worker shortage. So what is your take on that? Why are we seeing that? And what is a way we can kind of get ourselves out of that? Or is this something that just solves itself with some extra time? So how do you see that?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, and I'll probably not necessarily talk off of a pure data standpoint, but maybe more of a Mason opinion standpoint.
Well, you've done this for a little while, so.
I think it's a myriad of factors.
Okay.
I think primarily the 2 biggest right now. Well, let me say this. I think there's an overarching factor that's gone on in the United States, and I think it's occurred over, again, a couple of decades. I think it's really influenced the Gen Zs and the millennials. Mm-hmm. And that is, I was a child of the 80s. I always say I was the perfect Gen Xer. I went to junior high in 1980 and graduated college in 1990. So the 80s was my decade. I'm an 80s guy, right?
All right, yeah.
We all grew up, and I'm not saying it's all right or wrong necessarily, but we grew up with this idea of you went to work, right? I mean, I graduated from college in Utah, and I was working in 1990 on a political congressional campaign where you can actually look it up. It was one of the most startling upsets probably in congressional history, where one of the most Republican districts in the nation went Democrat that year because of a whole bunch of things that happened. I was working on the Republican campaign out of college after I graduated. So in November of 1990, I'm newly married in July of 1990, and all of our thoughts that we were going to move to Washington, D.C. and work for this new congressman were dashed one night. And I remember sitting down going to my wife going like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? Well, you know what I did? I went back to the job I had at a store called Shopco, which is like Walmart and Target, Shopco. And during the holidays, I worked for $3.85 an hour doing cashiering as a bachelor degree holder, because that's what you did, right? Mm-hmm. I think we've lost a lot of that. I think there's a lot of entitlement. I think there's a lot of the loss of the value of hard work and work ethic in this country. And to some extent, I think that's been purposefully done. And I think it's hamstringing us now. I think we're seeing some of the result of that people that think, well, unless it's $15 an hour, I'm too good to work for $10 an hour, whatever. Well, at the risk of sounding controversial, I've never believed anybody's too good to work for anything. It's work is to me is more important than the wage you earn. Work is about the skills you learn, the life's lessons. It's about persevering.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about just rolling up your sleeves. I mean, we've all done stuff we didn't like doing. I always tell the story when I was 16 years old, I was playing baseball in the summers because I played some college ball. So summer baseball was kind of important to me. And one morning on a Saturday, my mom drives me down to the Burger King in Lake Havasu, Arizona, and says, and when I said, Mom, why are we here on Saturday morning? She goes, because you're walking in there and applying for a job. And I was on the closing shift. I had to clean that stupid grill every night and was greasy and everything. You think that wasn't fun? And then I played baseball in between and stuff. I was tired, right?
Yeah.
But that's what you do. You learn the value of work. You learn all of that. And I think so overarching, I think that's a big problem we have in our country is I think a lot of people have gotten kind of an entitlement mentality. They sort of expect a certain quality of life. And part of that isn't, I don't have to work hard or overcome or deal with any challenges in my life. And I think we're suffering some of the consequences of that. Now, with that said, I think there are two other things going on. I absolutely think the unemployment insurance thing is an issue, and I sort of have my theory on that. I think it was a backdoor way to get to a $15 minimum wage because by keeping a segment of the market out of the labor market, it causes the large employers to announce we're all going to pay $15 an hour now. Puts the small business people at a real disadvantage.
Or automate,
Yeah, or automate. I mean, that's the reality of the minimum wage is, my father-in-law built a chain of fast food restaurants down in Columbia, South Carolina. And I always will never forget 1996. It was during the Olympics. We were at the beach and I was with him and I didn't see him that much. He and my wife didn't always get along, see eye to eye. So, but I said to him, I remember that's when minimum wage passed. It had been like since the 1980s that a minimum wage. And I said, hey, what do you think about the minimum wage passing? He goes, oh, I don't give a GD about the minimum wage. He literally said that, right? He didn't abbreviate. And I said, really? Why? He goes, because he was a pretty colorful guy in language and stuff. And I said, and he goes, because I won't pay it. And that's when I realized, you can hike the minimum wage to 15, 20. I don't care what you hike it to. There's always going to be a low end of wages. And there's always going to be a floor. And most of the gains people get from an increase in the minimum wage gets what we're seeing now paid back in higher prices and or loss of employment due to automation, period.
Right.
Period. And so I think we will see an uptick in availability of workers here in about another month when the extended unemployment benefits and the increases of $300 a month start running out. And the other thing that not many people are talking about, which some people have pointed out to me and I've kind of taken and run with it, is, we've been saying for a long, long time that the day was going to come when the baby boomers all retired and we didn't have enough workers to fill their spots. Well, the 2008 Great Recession delayed that because when people's 401ks went down, a lot of people in their 60s and maybe even 70s couldn't afford to retire and had to wait. Well, I think with COVID now, people didn't make the same mistake. They moved once they got their portfolios built back up or whatever. And I think we're seeing that now, too. I think a lot of the boomers just aren't coming back. They're done. COVID finally drove them out into retirement, and I think we got a whole bunch of empty seats. So I think we have a combination of boomers who've retired, a small generation of mine, Gen X, that aren't enough of us to fill those jobs, and a boomer or a millennial Gen Z generation that for a good portion of them think they're too good to work menial labor.
Yeah.
It's a simplistic view of it, but I think that's kind of at the heart of it. And unemployment insurance that has distorted the market to keep people out.
Right. And it's not like those things are unrelated, right? It's not like those things are totally separate. I mean, a big discussion that we've been having at the Archbridge Institute over these past couple of years has been universal basic income. And I am not a fan of that. I'm not a proponent of that. And I think that a big, it basically means that, people are, they're guaranteed, this standard of living, which is going to be constantly increasing. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a very strong social safety net.
You can't guarantee basic income. I heard a speaker, again, I was on a Joe Rogan podcast a year or so ago, was against basic income. And I think he was probably more of a liberal person too, and politically, but said the problem with the universal, you can start with $1,000 a month, but all the incentives are going to be there for people to vote in the politicians that continue to hike that. Well, who's going to say it's not going to become $5,000 a month or $6,000 a month or that sort of thing?
Right.
I think we're seeing. If you look at the unemployment insurance situation, we are seeing what a UBI, the impacts of what UBI would do, which is it would keep people out of the labor market and we would have a jobs problem.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote something similar to that effect. Of course, the one difference is that with the UBI, they wouldn't lose their benefit if they got a job as they would with the bonus unemployment insurance, right? So like
but if politicians gave you a certain amount of UBI, what's your incentive to go get a job? It's just like with the unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
Look, when you have unemployment insurance, think about it this way. If you have an average weekly benefit amount in the United States, it's let's say $350 unemployment. And you do what Congress did last year and you say, okay, we're going to give everybody $600 plus that a week. You're now talking $950 a week, which is like $3,600 a month. You're paying people over $30,000 salaries.
Yeah.
To not work.
Right.
Now it's $300. You're still giving people right now $300 plus the $350. So right now, even now, it's $1,200, $2,400 a month. If you were a lower wage, do you think you're going to go work serving at a restaurant when I can collect, $2,400 a month?
Yeah.
Doing nothing. And I'm not saying that's people's fault. That's the government distorting the labor market.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
If you're a rational person, you do exactly what people are doing. You're like, I'm not going to go work for whatever an hour and be worn out. I mean, I was just in Nashville for a meeting this weekend, and I walked into a pub, and one 5-month pregnant bartender, I sat at the bar and ate, and then two other servers. 3 people trying to manage a whole huge place.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law just called me over the weekend too. The fast food chain I'm talking about, she comes to Mason. We got big problem. We got stores closing at 5 p.m. because they don't have workers.
Yeah.
Fast food restaurant, very well known in South Carolina. Fast food, not chain of 9 of them.
Wow.
Closing at 5 o'clock because they don't have workers.
Yeah.
So they're missing the dinner hour, the dinner rush. They don't have enough people to serve dinner rush, which is a huge revenue time for a restaurant.
And then if that happens too much, then you kind of get into that death spiral too. I don't want to be too pessimistic on that particular situation, but you don't have the staff, you can't open, you can't operate during the productive, the profitable hours. You can't.
We see what's happening now. The Amazons and the Walmarts and the Targets swoop up all the workers who do want to work because they can afford to jack up wages, and the small businesses all close down.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why this whole COVID thing, that's why all this talk of more like lockdowns and mandates and stuff we'll finish off small businesses in this country if we do this again.
Yeah, there's no.
The other thing Ben, the other thing I didn't mention about the employment situation too, that I probably should, is female employment. I think there's pretty good evidence that because of the foolishness going on with our schools and other things, and sort of the inconsistency in are schools open, not open, what's going on, is a lot of women feel like I can't go back to work because I got to hold down the household.
Yeah.
So I think that's exacerbating the problem too, is I think our female reemployment as a result of COVID is a big problem too.
Yeah, I've definitely seen at least some evidence of that, where, like it or not, that it tends to fall on women more often than men, when it involves kids and households. And you have these schools where they're just like, oh, we're open these days, but if we hit these metrics, then we're not open those days and stuff. And It's just like, well, that's a nightmare. That's a nightmare for trying to get childcare and like, let alone trying to set like a consistent schedule for a job or something. Like that's not going to be good. So, all right. Well, I guess that's as good a place to leave it as any on that.
Yeah.
On that cheery note.
I appreciate chatting with you.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed it, and I hope that people can take away a lot of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there, and I'll be working as much as I can to encourage states to streamline their programs and try to boost community colleges and hold back some of these further lockdowns and things like that. But, I think that you and I both know we've got kind of an uphill battle that we're facing here, but I'm glad that we're here to keep pushing.
Well, and if it's okay, I can give my email. Anybody can email me if they want to reach out. It's Mason, my first name, Mason, at WorkEdConsulting.com, WorkED Consulting.com.
Yeah, that's great. And anyone can reach out to you. I'll make sure I include that in the note, the notes for this podcast as well. And thanks again for being willing to talk with me today.
Thanks, Ben. Take care.
All right, you too.